I recently picked up a new, well, new to me, jointer. It is the Model 3400 made by Boise-Crane out of Toledo, Ohio, and it runs on 220 volts using a 1 1/2 horsepower motor. It has an 8-inch wide, 4-knife cutter head. Unlike my recent project of restoring an old Craftsman / Parks planer, this machine came to me in fairly good condition, with a few caveats. The construction of this jointer is quite interesting. Rather than being made out of cast iron, it's entirely formed from thick steel plates that have been welded together and then surface ground. From the literature I read about it, this is supposed to be a desirable feature. After all, steel is harder than cast iron and less likely to be abraded by material passing over it. It's also supposed to be lighter weight than a comparable joiner in cast iron. Even with this presumed weight savings, this is still one extremely heavy beast. The adjustment slide wasn't damaged, but it was completely plugged up with old grease and sawdust. A quick cleaning made it work smoothly again. Even though this machine was not going to require a full restoration, it still had several issues. The knife jibs had apparently gotten jammed in the cutter head at some point, and the former owner had sheared off several of the jib screws while trying to remove them. Additionally, the top had several places of heavy rusting that would need to be cleaned and polished out. The electrics were sketchy, and it looked like it was missing a few pieces of hardware. Like the planer body, the fence is made out of a similar construction method, welded plates of steel together, and it weighs about 60 pounds on its own. It has a nice feature of being able to lock the tilt while still being adjustable front to back. This allows you to keep the fence at 90 degrees, but move to different knife positions without throwing off the angle. Since the top is machined steel, I didn't want to abrade it by running sandpaper over it. Instead, I opted for WD-40 and some milder abrasives. I started out with steel wool, but it didn't cut the rust aggressively enough, so I switched over to a maroon Scotch-Brite pad, and that seemed to work a whole lot better. After a thorough scrubbing, removing the WD-40 was easy enough with some mineral spirits. To protect the top from future rusting, I gave it a liberal coating of paste wax, allowed that to dry, and then came back later with a buffing cloth to remove the excess. Repairing the knife gibs proved quite challenging. Only 2 of the 4 knives were installed in the machine because 2 of the gibs each had broken off studs or misdrilled tapped holes in them. I am not a machinist, but I figured I'd have a go at it with my basic tools and a drill press. To remove the broken studs, I first filed them level with the rest of the plate to give myself a flat surface to work from. I then attempted to drill out the bolts, but I had a lot of problems with the bit trying to wander off center, particularly when the bolt had broken off just below the surface. I ended up grabbing an end mill and milling the tops of the bolts dead flat. I could then dimple the bolt with a center punch and drill a straight hole. I went back and forth between the drill bits and a screw extractor, trying in vain to back the bolts out. In the end, none of them budged, and I had to completely drill them out and re-tap the bolt holes. When I went to pull the motor out, I found that it was loose on its pivot bolt because it was missing one of the circlips on the ends. I have to imagine this was causing all kinds of vibration and noise during operation. The motor is a Reliance Duty Master out of Dayton, Ohio. 1.5 horsepower, 9.1 amps, 3,450 RPM, single phase. I wanted to remove the motor and closely examine the wiring, because although the previous owner said that he had been using the machine, the rubber insulation was petrified and cracked, and I really didn't trust it. After opening the access cover on the motor, I'm glad I took the time to upgrade the line cord. The previous one was completely shot. switch was original, made in the USA. You hardly ever see a US-made switch anymore. The action was still nice and crisp, too. Wiring the switch went off without a hitch. The old plug used an incompatible 20 amp configuration. All of the 220 volt outlets in my garage are 30 amp, so I picked up a replacement plug kit. I particularly like these Leviton units. They're easy to put together, they're rock solid once assembled, and they have excellent cord strain relief. This was the first start with all the new wiring. I was so confident in that wiring that I threw the switch with a 3-foot section of dowel rod. Yes, that probably makes me a coward. I went ahead and did a test pass using the old worn-out knives, and with only 2 of them installed. The cut quality was predictably less than stellar, but even with worn knives and only half of them, the stock moved through the machine smoothly and with a confident level of control. Next step was to replace the old knives. I found some replacement bolts for the gibs, but quickly found that they wouldn't fit the cutter head slot. The new bolts were both too long and the head on them was too thick. Although doing this on a mill would have been a lot easier, you can accomplish a similar effect with a power sander. I ended up doing a dozen or so bolts so that I would have some spares. By the way, pro tip, do not try to pick up the bolt immediately after you've machined it. It will be hot. Don't ask me how I know that. The replacement knives are 8 inches wide, 3/4 of an inch high, and 1/8 of an inch thick. I found a good deal on some new original stock Freud blades on eBay, so that worked out pretty well. Each knife has a little micro adjuster at the end that allows you to raise or lower the knife in the slot. It makes setting the knife height a whole lot easier. The knives are held in place by friction tension, with the bolts pressing the knife and the gib tightly against the wall of the cutter head slot. As you can imagine, it's important that you get all the bolts securely tightened. You don't want a knife flying off. After getting all the knives installed and adjusted, a fresh cut pass showed excellent finish. In fact, it was so cleanly machined that it appeared slightly shiny, with no tear out, gouging, or any noticeable snipe on either end of the board. I am quite anxious to put this baby to work, and I am loving the 7-foot bed length. So nice. I also really like how the cutter guard is easy to temporarily move out of the way without completely removing it. Overall, this seems like a really great machine, and I'll have new videos of upcoming projects that I'll be building with it.